On April 5th, 1943, some Brazilian fishermen noted something out at sea. As they came closer, they could tell it was a raft and see that there was a person on the raft waving at them, obviously seeking help. As they approached the raft, they saw an emaciated man who said, "Good morning." His name was Poon Lim, and his extraordinary story of survival is one of the most amazing of the Second World War. Poon Lim's raft deserves to be remembered. In many ways, the Second World War hinged, as the First World had, on the British merchant fleet. According to the Imperial War Museums, in 1939, nearly a third of the merchant ships in the world were British. It was the largest merchant navy in the world. The website of National Museums Liverpool explains, in the Second World War, as in the First, the merchant navy was to be Britain's lifeline. In 1939, Britain, an island nation of 48 million people, depended for her survival upon maritime trade. Her 1,900 ocean-going merchant ships, manned by crews from throughout the Commonwealth, were part of the formal largest merchant fleet in the world. With help from the men and ships of friendly nations, they brought into the country all of her oil, half her food, and most of her raw materials. The news site CTGN Europe explains that if the Second World War was won by the side with the most resources, then it was won by seafarers in the Atlantic and Arctic Oceans, as much as by soldiers on the beaches of Normandy or the towns of Belgium. If enough weapons, food, and men could make it across the Atlantic to Britain and to its Russian ally, Nazi Germany could be defeated. If the U-boats and the Luftwaffe could sink enough British ships carrying those supplies, Hitler had a hope of victory. And the Germans certainly tried. Writing in the journal Diplomatic History in 2014, Meredith Oyen of the University of Maryland notes that between 1939 and 1945, German U-boats sank more than 3,500 Allied merchant ships, killing more than 36,000 civilian seamen. At times, Marine casualty rates exceeded even those of the armed forces. A significant percentage of the men facing those risks did not come from the British Isles. National Museums Liverpool writes that in 1938, the British Merchant Service employed over 190,000 seafarers. Of those, over 130,000 were British residents, and 50,000 Indian and Chinese. The war brought in new stresses. Not only was the merchant navy taking losses, but thousands of its sailors were joining the Royal Navy. CTGN writes, but with many of its own sailors fighting in the Royal Navy, Britain needed thousands of mariners from across the world to crew the vital merchant ships. Many came from the British Empire, but more than 1 in 7 of the men who braved the U-boats, storms, and freezing conditions was Chinese. Yet these sailors faced great difficulties, quite aside from the U-boats. Chinese sailors were paid approximately 1/3 what a British seaman was paid and did not receive the war risk bonus, otherwise known as the danger money, that British seamen received in time of war. When Chinese sailors died, about 100 had been killed already in the Battle of the Atlantic by 1940, their families did not receive compensation on the scale of a British sailor. And the website Dragon and Lions notes Chinese sailors were sometimes subject to violence at the hands of British crews and officers. Despite a wartime propaganda film called The Chinese in Britain proclaiming shoulder to the greatest battle of naval history alongside their British seamen comrades, they too braved the torpedoes, the bombs, and the mines, making history under fire. Labor disputes occurred over the course of the war, reducing some of the problems, but life of a Chinese sailor in the British Merchant Navy was still one full of risks. Yet tens of thousands braved that risk. Among them was a young man from China's far southern Hainan Island named Poon Lim. Lim had originally enlisted with a British merchant vessel in 1934 at the age of 16, but after 3 years at sea had returned to Hong Kong to study a trade. In 1940, when it looked like the Japanese would attack Hong Kong, at his cousin's suggestion he returned to the merchant navy as a second steward on his cousin's ship, the SS Ben Lomond. In her 1999 book, Sole Survivor, author Ruth Ann McCunn writes, increasingly high casualties and the growth of war-associated shipping created a need for additional manpower. In 1940, the British Merchant Navy sent out a call for Chinese seamen. Poon Lim was among those who answered the call. A young man of 22, he signed articles of agreement for second steward on the Ben Lomond, a Scots officered ship of 9,675 tons, with a crew of 47, half Scots and half Chinese, and 8 gunners. Built in 1922, the ship belonged to Scottish shipping company the Ben Line, the names of whose vessels all started with Ben. In late 1942, Ben Lomond was sailing from Port Said in Egypt to New York via Cape Town, South Africa. and Paramaribo, Dutch Guiana, under the command of her master, a Scotsman named John Mall. She left Cape Town in ballast, due to pick up cargo at Paramaribo. The ship was armed with a 4-inch gun for defense, but was traveling unescorted. The voyage was without incident until November 23rd. The Melbourne, Australia Age wrote in 1960, "For 12 days the Ben Lomond sailed under course for Paramaribo, Dutch Guiana, but on the 13th day, when she was about 750 miles from the mouth of the Amazon, she was sighted by a lurking submarine." The submarine was the Type 9C U-boat U-172, under the command of Captain Lieutenant Carl Emmerman. The boat was on its third war patrol, having already scored a significant success sinking the troopship SS Orcades on October 10th. The U-172 struck the Ben Lomond while submerged. There was no warning before the 2 torpedoes struck. Poon Lin had been about to start his duties when the first torpedo struck. McCunn writes, "The ship lurched, slamming him across the engineer steward's bunk. Then she heeled sharply, flinging him onto the deck. Ashtray, bedding, and mattress tumbled after him, and he heard a great creaking and thrashing of gear. Staggering to his feet, he wondered if a lookout had sighted a submarine. An explosion rocked through the tiers of still decks, hurling Lim back onto the deck." The Age writes, Poon Lim grabbed his lifebelt and raced for his lifeboat station. According to McCunn, who interviewed Poon Lim for her book, when he managed to get across the lurching ship to his lifeboat station, it was already gone. But he saw some officers trying to lower another boat at the bridge station and went to help. McCunn writes, "Then just as they raised the boat off the chocks, a noise like thunder ripped through the Ben Lomond's bowels. The bulkhead of the main holds collapsed. 'Tie your life jackets on tight and go over the side,' the second mate ordered." That was a terrifying idea. Poon Lim did not know how to swim. McCunn writes that the second mate told him, "For God's sake, jump! Then swim like mad, or you'll be pulled down with the ship." But there was no time. The Ben Lomond sunk in under 2 minutes. Before Poon Lim could respond to the second mate, McCunn writes that the stern plummeted. Tons of greasy poured into the ship, forcing it into a death roll, and Lim was sucked into a punishing black swirl. Pulled down as the vessel went under, Lim was nearly drowned, choking on the black oil in the water. The pull tore off his slippers and his trousers. He might have died had not, McCunn notes, the buoyancy of his kapok jacket brought him to the surface and kept him afloat. Kapok is a naturally occurring fiber harvested from a tropical tree. It's highly buoyant, resistant to water, was commonly used in life jackets until replaced by synthetic materials. Journalist Frank Wright wrote in the Omaha, Nebraska World Herald in 1968, "The oil clogged over Poon Lim's eyes, blocked his nostrils and ears. He clung to a wooden box and kicked with his feet to get clear of the fouled water. Once he was out of the water, his vision blurred by the oil, he saw a life raft with men aboard. But McCunn writes, as he tried to make his way to the raft, the U-boat surfaced and took the men from the raft aboard. Afraid that the crew might kill him, he hid from the U-boat. After some time, the men were placed back on the raft, and the U-boat submerged and left." The Age writes, "Of the Ben Lomond, there was no sign. The torpedo had blown half her bottom away, and she had sunk with appalling rapidity. In the oil-soaked mess, the boat drifted away and was unable to get their attention. He never saw it again." The Age writes, "There was not a boat in sight. He could see none of the rest of the crew, although for a short time he heard some pitiful cries for help. Then there was an eerie silence." The Chicago Tribune wrote in May 1943, "For an hour the steward swam until he sighted an unoccupied life raft and climbed aboard." The raft that he found was a Carley float, patented by American Horace Carley in 1903. The Carley float used a copper or steel tube that was a foot or more in diameter, bent into an oval ring. The tube was then covered with kapok and covered with waterproof canvas. The Carley raft had advantages over traditional lifeboats and inflatable rafts. Unlike a lifeboat, it was light and could simply be thrown overboard, rather than having to be lowered by a rope mechanism. But it was more durable than notably fragile inflatable rafts, and it did not have to be inflated. It simply could be stored on a deck or mounted against any open surface. It floated as well on either side. But Carley floats were open to the weather and left the risk that men aboard might die of exposure. Wright writes that it was 6 feet square and of standard design, with a container, fore and aft. The raft had been supplied with, the Age writes, 6 boxes of hardtack, 2 pounds of chocolate, 10 small cans of pemmican, 1 bottle of lime juice, 5 cans of evaporated milk, and 10 gallons of water. The stores were, the Tribune writes, meant to sustain several men for a short period. In addition, the raft carried 2 paddles, some rope, a flashlight, and some signal flares. It was far from perfect. The floor of the raft was made from wooden slats, and the water splashed through. It was an uncomfortable way to sleep, but if he tried to sleep on top of the float, which would keep him out of the water, he ran the risk of falling off in his sleep into the ocean, and he couldn't swim. He lost his pants, but managed, the age writes, to make a sort of sarong out of a burlap bag. Then, the age writes, the weary, lonely hours stretched into days. On he drifted, covering little more than an average of 5 miles a day, although by then he had lost all idea of distance and direction in the vast expanse of lonely sea, the age continued. At the end of 3 weeks, he realized that he was to survive. He would have to add to his fast diminishing stock of food and water. The Baltimore Sun reported in May 1943 that the food lasted for 55 days. The water held out for 65 days. He took apart his life jacket, as risky as that was, and used the canvas to make an awning that both protected him from the sun and could collect rainwater. He spread the kapok from the life jacket on the floor of the raft, and when it rained, the kapok would soak up the water, which he could then wring out into a container. He fashioned a knife from one of the cans. He fashioned a fishhook from some wire in the flashlight, and then a larger one from a nail pulled from the planking on the raft floor. He first used some biscuit as bait, and when he caught a small fish, he cut it into strips and caught a larger one. He then used the entrails from that fish to catch more. He cut the fish into strips and dried it in the sun. Wright writes that, using this method, he was seldom without fish during his marathon ordeal at sea. The Chicago Tribune writes that he kept account of time by counting the days from the time the moon was full. The Tribune continues, once he fell overboard, but the sea was calm and he managed to swim back to the raft. He felt dizzy several times and suffered slight attacks of fever, but was bothered mostly by the gnawing pains in his stomach, caused by hunger. The Miami, Florida News reported in May 1943 that when asked how he passed the time, Poon Lim said that he sang native folk songs. Most of the time, however, he said he just made his mind blank or slept. The Age writes that the thing he most feared now was insanity. He saw several ships, but none recognized his flares. Maybe they didn't see him, or maybe they feared that it was a U-boat trap, as they were known to use flares to get ships to slow down. And there were times when there was no rain. The Age writes, after 100 days, his water supply was nil because there had been no rain for nearly a week. For the next 5 days, Poon Lim knew the tortures of thirst before the rain came down again in equatorial torrents. Wright writes that sometimes when there was no rain, he lowered a tin into the sea and waited for hours while the humidity in the air condensed within the tin and dribbled down the sides into the bottom. The Age reports that now and again seabirds settled on his raft, and using phenomenal patience and self-control, Poon Lim managed to catch some. But the Age continues, the days passed with maddening slowness, but Poon Lim drifted on, his body becoming blacker, his frame thinner, his spirit unconquerable. Then the Chicago Tribune reports, after 128 days, Poon Lim saw the outline of land many miles away, but he couldn't maneuver his raft towards it. A plane flew low overhead, enough to make it clear that it had seen him, but the plane flew off and didn't return. The Miami News reported that the pilot later told him that he had sighted the raft at sea, had flown back to find food to drop for him, but had been unable to find the raft when he returned. Finally, Wright writes, when Poon Lim awoke on the sunny morning of April 5th, 1943, his 133rd day on the raft, he saw a forest-covered shore, and in the foreground a fleet of small Brazilian fishing boats. One of them sailed towards his raft. In the boat were 3 women and 4 men. Then, showing how unconquerable his spirit was, he greeted them. "Good morning," he said. While it was initially reported that he had been adrift for 131 days, it was officially determined that he'd actually been adrift for 133 days, which the Miami News noted broke the previous record for drifting in a raft by about 50 days. And yet, despite his ordeal when the fishing boat arrived on shore, he was able to climb onto dry land under his own strength. He was taken to a hospital. It took him 45 days to recover. When he was told that he had broken the record for days adrift in a life raft, he said, "I hope no one ever has to break that record." And while since a few people have survived longer on disabled boats, to this day, no one has broken Poon Lim's record for days adrift in a life raft. As to the men that he had seen alive on a lifeboat from the Ben Lomond after it had sunk, they were never rescued. It's not clear who it was that had survived long enough to be interrogated by the Germans, but he was the only survivor of the Ben Lomond that was ever found. Poon then became a bit of a celebrity. He was given the British Empire Medal by King George VI, and he traveled around the world telling his stories and teaching survival skills. He decided to relocate to the United States, eventually became a citizen, and passed away in 1991 in Brooklyn, New York, at the age of 72. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on Forgotten History, all you have to do is subscribe.